Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar about the advanced methods in demand response. We're going to be highlighting our report that we worked on last year with our colleagues over at the California ISO. Jill Powers is going to share her perspective on why we initiated this study with them. And I just wanted to thank the CAISO in advance for their support of this analysis, for the work that Adam did, in addition to Joe Glass, Steve Suffian, to bring it all together, and all the reviewers and data donors, et cetera, that contributed to the report. I think as we start this analysis, while it is a California context that we're going to be talking about, it really has a lot of resonance and relevance for a lot of different jurisdictions that are considering innovations or modifications potentially to their demand response methods with the advent of FERC 2x4, more investments in utility side demand response, et cetera. There's just lots of applications where these methods could be put to good use. So with that, I will hand it over to Jill to just say a few words about the purpose of the study, and then from there we'll go to Adam.
Great, thank you, Carmen. Good to see you, good to see Adam, and welcome everybody to this morning's, I guess afternoons for where others might be, call. I did want to just start the conversation just to give a little bit of backstory about, why the ISO had initiated this particular study with Recurve. If we go to the next slide, Adam. Just to kind of set the stage, the ISO, we have had integrated into our markets our what we term a supply side demand response. And with that integration, we had started just very with one particular day matching 10 of 10 baseline method. But now we have a variety of different methodologies that are used by our demand response providers in terms of performance measurement and settlement of the energy that they provide via the markets and services they provide via the markets. So at this point in time, we support 3 different types of baseline types, one being control groups, one being day matching, and the other being weather matching. So we've really expanded from just the early days of day matching as the demand response providers have started to develop these different types of demand response programs. We initially started with utility integrated. We expanded that to third parties who have been really out there and employing different technologies and different types of program development. So we really needed to expand different types of performance methodologies to kind of keep up with these advancements and these technology advancements. I did want to point out that even though we have the 3 types, within these types, there are different variations. So we ended up kind of having a performance measurement that covers like 17 different types of, permutations of these different baseline types, but most of them are utilizing the day matching. So even though we've had all of these, most of our participants are using the day matching baseline type. And I also wanted to point out that both the day matching and the weather matching employ adjustment factors, and these adjustment factors do have caps. If we go to the next slide, kind of to lay out some of the issues that we started hearing from our demand response providers, particularly during high heat events in 2020. There was just, indication that even with these different types and variations on these baseline types, that there was energy deliveries that were exceeding those that these baseline methodologies were calculating in terms of the energy settlement at the ISO for the services that they provided. And there was contention that this was on average 106% greater particularly because of the adjustment cap and those adjustment factors, which are capped at 40% date of adjustment. So that was a big kind of contention that we heard from our demand response providers, particularly in 2020. And we took a look, and we've looked at the intraday load on the system, and looking at the historic versus what was happening on those high heat events. There was evidence that these baseline characteristics may not be capturing the full demand response and the full performance values during that period of time. I also want to point out that while this was mainly kind of pointed at the ISO, this was with regard to how they performed during these high heat events when we did a study on these events during 2020. It does, when you start looking at it at a broader level, it does affect both energy and capacity compensation, not just to the ISO, but really across multiple agencies and parties in California. As mentioned, the ISO, the big purpose there was for performance measurement, for energy settlement, but the California Public Utilities Commission also uses these type of baselines for qualified capacity valuation. And then the utilities are also utilizing these same type of baseline methodologies in evaluating the contracts that they've entered into with demand response providers through the demand response auction mechanism. So it really has a broader kind of impact, and that was something that was being brought forward by our aggregators. And if we move to the last slide. So in response, we were listening to our participants, listening to our demand response providers, and we decided to make some enhancements, to reevaluate our baselines, to look to see if there were ways that we could enhance them. We reached out to Recurve, having heard about some of their other studies that they had done, particularly with some of our own California demand response participants. And we wanted to take a deeper look into the control group or Recurve's comparison methods. So we really wanted to take a look at if those comparison methods were compatible or compliant with what we had instituted already within our tariff for control group types. So that was the one thing that Recurve did in their study, is to do this comparison. And we found that the Recurve method was compliant with what we had laid out in terms of a comparison control group method. The study also, this was a benefit to us, that Recurve provided us with improvements on our specifications in terms of how we could improve and enhance the control group method that we already had in place, and to develop better specifications within our business practices. I think one of the last items that this study really brought out is to demonstrate the use of this differential privacy, because of the fact that we need to overcome the barrier of data access and data handling by our demand response providers in order for them to take advantage of a control group method and develop these type of comparison groups, the quality comparison groups. So that was a big part of the study, big demonstration of the study that will further our efforts in working with our other state agencies in really trying to make this a method, a performance measurement available to all of our participants, including our third-party demand response providers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam. I hope that was enough briefing to give a little bit of flavor before you dig into the meat of the study and report.
Thanks, Jill. I'm just curious, do you have a dog?
I do. I was worried that was going to happen.
Oh no, that's okay. What's your dog's name?
It is Rosa, and she is a mutt, but mainly a Pyrenees Australian Shepherd mix. So very high energy.
Well, that makes sense because Pyrenees Australian Shepherd mixes are known to love comparison groups. So give
Okay,
Ray's a scratch behind the ears for us, if you would. Well,
I
thank
will.
you so much, Jill. We really appreciate the background and kind of laying the foundation for the study and the goals of the study. And we'll talk quite a bit about the methods going forward. I did just want to give a little bit of background to add a little bit of context to kind of how and why we came to be measuring demand response. And a lot of the context and it can really be traced back to the inception of COVID, believe it or not. And when COVID hit, Recurve, who has typically been a firm that has focused quite a bit on measuring energy efficiency savings, we're measuring programs across the country in energy efficiency portfolios. And when COVID hit and the state of California and other jurisdictions across the country underwent lockdowns, we saw major disruptions, major changes in energy consumption patterns. So I'm just showing a graph here where the blue line gives the average daily load shape of a residential customer and their usage that we would predict in the absence of COVID versus what happened in the months right after the statewide lockdowns went into effect, shown in the orange line. Residential customers were using quite a bit more, and they were using quite a bit more in the middle of the day in particular. So it wasn't just that people were using more, they were using more at specific times of day. And the commercial sector showed kind of an opposite trend where people were using less or buildings were using less because, folks, instead of being in the office, were at home. And a lot of these COVID effects were much greater than the load impacts you might get from a typical energy efficiency program. So this really was a crisis in measurement of energy efficiency, in particular for a lot of these nascent programs that are being paid and valued based on the savings that are observed at the meter. So we needed, the community in energy efficiency really needed a way to account for and remove the impacts that COVID was having on energy consumption at an hourly level. So we dove in and we partnered with the Department of Energy to produce what we called the grid meter methods. And these grid meter methods were a number of comparison group methodologies. And this report that we partnered with the DOE, but we had a lot of stakeholder input and feedback, and we developed this over the course of the summer of 2020, detailed a number of sampling methodologies for the selection of comparison groups, and then also detailed how you would go about making that savings adjustment calculation at an hourly level. And one of the methodologies that a former engineer of Recurve, Steve Soufian, really had a large hand in creating was called site-based matching. And this site-based matching is like an individual site level matching scheme where you take every participating customer in a program and you find their doppelganger out in the wild of non-participant data, and you pull them in as a representation of that particular customer. Then you aggregate all of the participant and non-participant customers that have been matched together, and you get a comparison group that is very representative of your treatment groups. That's the goal of site-based matching. What's the goal of any comparison group really, is to be a good representation of the participating customer group, the only difference being they're not participating in a program. Then you can look and you can see, well, what's the impact that we're observing from something like COVID that everybody is experiencing. And then you can adjust for what you're observing in the participating customer group to remove the impacts of those, what we call exogenous factors, COVID being a great example of one. And so we had these hourly methods for the selection of comparison groups and the adjustment of savings calculations. And of course, demand response is a resource that has to be measured on an hourly level. And what we're showing here is just that the case that was the situation on the California grid in August, late August of 2020. There were these rotating power outages that were brought on by an extreme heat wave. And obviously that extreme heat wave caused a spike in demand and caused a lot of congestion across the grid. And for folks outside of California, we were experiencing greater than 100-degree temperatures in the San Francisco Bay Area. And temperatures were rising even above 110 degrees in places like Sacramento or places in the Central Valley in California. This really, and then other places across the western part of the states were also experiencing extreme heat wave. So we wound up in a situation where we had a large supply constraint. So this was an emergency on the California grid, and the governor called an all hands on deck type of approach to address this. So the demand response providers were really engaged heavily, and they went out to their customers and had events basically day after day after day during this week of an extreme heat wave. But as Jill mentioned, when folks were using these day matching methods that had been capped at the time, the resource ended up being undervalued. So we also, at the same time, had a partnership with NREL and also the Department of Energy to facilitate the use of non-participant data with advanced privacy techniques. So in order to enable comparison group selection in that accurate measurement of something like COVID, but also to be able to, take a look at how flex alerts or other types of exogenous impacts that non-participating customers may be experiencing with respect to demand response, we thought there's an important application here where we can take these comparison group methods and we can see how they function in a demand response scenario. So we were very fortunate that we had a couple partners in this study, MCE and OhmConnect, who provided data on a single event that took place on August 14th in MCE territory during that August heat wave. And we were able to make a comparison group measurement with non-participant data provided by MCE that was differentially privatized. And we'll talk a little bit more about that privatization of data and how it enables non-participant data, the usage of non-participant data in a bit. But we conducted this study, and it was a demonstration of how you could take these grid meter methods and hourly measurement of savings using Caltrak, which is an open source package, and privatize non-participant data to enable the formation and the utilization of comparison groups, which a lot of evaluators have called over the years a best practice compared to some of these other methods that only use participant data. So let's just visit really quickly how comparison groups function in principle, and then we'll talk a lot more about how we go about this in practice for the measurement of demand response. But essentially, these methods, as Jill said, are approved in the CAISO tariff. The CAISO tariff lays out a framework for utilization of control groups. I'm calling them comparison groups here. There are some subtle differences that aren't important to get into. But these methods are laid out in the CAISO tariff. And as I said, they're often considered a best practice. There was a baseline accuracy working group that was formulated in 2017 that came forward with a report that really promoted the use of comparison groups for the measurement of demand response to get the most accurate measurement. But despite the approval in the tariff and the fact that they're a best practice, they've actually rarely, if ever, been used for settlement of demand response resource. And I think there are a couple reasons for this. One is because it's been very difficult for utilities to share and provide non-participant data due to privacy concerns. You have to have non-participant data to formulate a comparison group in the first place. And secondly, because these methods have never really been utilized, they haven't been fleshed out. Nobody really understands, well, what could I expect out of a set of methods like that? Would they really work? Nobody wants to be, first in line for something like a new method that is uncertain how you're going to get paid, which is totally understandable. So CAISO said to us, we've really got a few key objectives in this study. First, we want to understand and operationalize this comparison group method that we had demonstrated with NREL and the DOE using differential privacy. Like I mentioned, that was one event with one DRP in one particular part of California. But would these methods work at scale, across the board, when we're talking about residential and commercial programs, when we're talking about different types of programs, when we're talking about different service territories, solar and non-solar customers. There are many, many different situations you could imagine for a demand response program. And would these methods that we demonstrated for NREL actually function when we looked at a wider variety of circumstances? Second, we wanted to identify and provide viable pathways to overcome barriers to data access. If comparison groups are to be utilized, we have to find ways to utilize non-participant data and to enable data sharing in a way that doesn't compromise individual customer privacy. And that's really what differential privacy intends to address. And again, I'll get to that a little more in detail in a bit. Then we wanted to better understand the 2020 heat storm events. When these events were originally measured using a capped day matching baseline, many DRPs found that their resources were being underutilized, or I'm sorry, undervalued. Effectively, what was happening is when you scale up a prediction of consumption, but that scaling is capped, then a very, very hot day can actually lead to the need to scale beyond what that cap would typically imply. And so that's what happened in these 2020 heat storm events. And there's been a lot of back and forth about the validity of these caps or whether these caps should be permanently removed. We can talk a little bit more if there are questions later on about issues with day matching baselines. But I think suffice to say, whether they're capped or uncapped, you can run into issues with these kinds of baselines. So we wanted to better make a measurement that actually gave us some insight into what happened during these 2020 heat storm events and the impact that these demand response programs had. And then finally, like I said a minute ago, we wanted to really operationalize this at scale. So is this type of approach something that can be just utilized in kind of a boutique, heavily detailed study on one or two events, or can it be applied across the board, across many different kinds of programs? And can it provide apples to apples comparisons and consistency of measurement? So in order to take on these, aggressive objectives for this study, we really needed data. And so Recurve, when we had the go-ahead from CAISO, started reaching out to demand response providers, load serving entities across the state of California. And we were thrilled that folks really heeded this call. So we had a number of volunteer data donors, a number of demand response providers, as well as a whole bunch of community choice aggregators and even an investor-owned utility in California that provided data for this study. So we actually ended up with a whole bunch of different kinds of programs and different territories across California. We hit most of California in terms of where we were carrying out this study. We had a variety of programs, everything from sort of residential behavioral programs all the way to commercial load scheduling and direct engagement of customers. And these programs provided a great test bed for these methods. So we're going to call these methods the flex meter methods, as opposed to the CAISO approved tariff comparison group methodologies. So I hope folks will bear with me, and we'll use the term flex meter to define everything that we're going to talk about from here on forward. So the foundation of flex meter methods are really a bunch of open source packages that Recurve has developed with stakeholders over the years. And it really starts with Caltrak. Caltrak itself is a time of week and temperature model that was developed in a stakeholder process that included the CPUC, PG&E, the CEC, a number of evaluators and subject matter experts. And Caltrak is really what provides an individual meter baseline model that you can project forward to create a prediction of energy consumption after a program has taken place. So for example, Caltrak would provide us with a prediction of energy consumption on an event day that would predict what the usage would be in the absence of that event. That gives us a foundation to then compare to what customers actually used on that event day, and then make a determination of the difference between the prediction and what we observe, and that becomes the unadjusted value of the savings. Then the open grid meter is what allows us to sample a comparison group and then compare the same results from a comparison group to what we measured for the participating customers and adjust savings accordingly. Then we also have a library that's open to the public called Privacy, and Privacy has the foundational methods that we're applying to enable differential privacy. And all of these code bases are open source and available for anybody to download and use and inspect. And all of them are being put to use to put forward these more comprehensive flex meter methods. So what are these methods? Fundamentally, there's really 4 aspects to these load impact calculations. The first is that we take the group of participating customers and we match a comparison group to them. And I'll talk about how exactly we do this, but the first thing we do is we match a comparison group. So this comparison group is intended to be very representative of the customers that participated in the program, and therefore provides a good basis for adjusting savings calculations accordingly. Then we calculate the treatment and comparison group hourly load impacts. A totally analogous calculation is made between the participating customers and the non-participating customers. And then we conduct what we call a difference of differences calculation, which adjusts for the participant savings based on the trends we're observing in the comparison group. And then finally, we utilize differential privacy when we release results such that non-participant data is protected. So let's just step through the kind of schematic of how comparison groups work. So the first step is we take a look at the change in consumption for program participants. This is really what did we predict versus what did we observe. And in this case, this is called the treatment difference. And so for this particular hypothetical, we see some positive savings, or this would be like an event period load reduction for a treatment group. We then do an analogous measurement for non-participating customers, the comparison group. And in this case, maybe we saw that the comparison group used actually a little bit more than we would have predicted. So we need to adjust the savings that we assign to the program based not only on what we're observing in the treatment group, but also what we're observing in that non-participant group, the comparison group. So the savings for this event or whatever it is would be the combination of the impacts we're observing in the treatment group and those that we're observing in the comparison group. So the first step in the flex meter methods is that matching of a comparison group. And we're using this site-based matching scheme that I described a little bit earlier. This is how we actually do that. So the first thing is that we take all of the treatment groups and we basically bin them by category. And when I say category, what I mean is they have to share the same sector, they have to be of the same LSE territory, climate zone, and they have to have the same solar status. So we want to be binning customers such that these groups of customers are expected to experience weather in the same way. They're expected to experience any kind of exogenous factors in the same way, like COVID. So for example, you want to match residential customers to other residential customers. You want to match solar customers to other solar customers. You want to match customers in a hot climate region to other customers in that same hot climate region or inland climate region or whatever it may be. And so the first thing we do is we take our customers that participated in the program and we group them into every combination of these particular categories. We do the same exact thing for every possible non-participant customer that we have data for. So we then, after we do this initial segmentation on category, we then use the average weekly load shape as the basis for comparison between every customer. So effectively, we take every single participating customer, we calculate their baseline period or pre-program average weekly load shape, and then we compare that average weekly load shape to every possible non-participating customer that is of the same category. Once we do that, we can pick out the customers that are the best match. So we're basically doing a sum of squares calculation on the basis of average weekly load shape. And then we're pulling in the customers into the comparison group that are those customers from that broader non-participant group that are the best matches on an individual meter basis to the participating customers. So this is sort of what that looks like. I'm just showing average daily load shape here, but the top is the average daily load shape on a weekday during the baseline period. The green curve are the customers that participated in this program. The orange curve, that orange dotted curve, is the comparison pool. That's the group of non-participating customers before we've selected it down into a comparison group. And then the red curve is the group of non-participating customers that we've ultimately selected to be the representation of the best representation of the treatment group. And then the bottom graph shows the same thing, but for the weekend. And it's important to look at the reason we're using average weekly load shape and not just average daily load shape as the basis for this comparison is very simply that weekday and weekend load patterns can vary dramatically among different customers. And a demand response event occurs on a particular day. So it's either going to occur on a Tuesday or a Saturday, but it's not some weird mix of the two. So we want to make sure that we're not just matching on average daily load shape, but we're actually pulling in that variety of usage that occurs across weekdays and weekends, so that we can get a good representation of an event day, which is going to occur either on a weekday or on a weekend. Then one of the key things about these methods is we're not just aggregating usage and checking whether or not we've got the total average of all of the comparison group versus the total average of all of the treatment group. We're looking across the entire spectrum of treatment customers, and we're making sure that we have a good load shape match across that entire spectrum. So here I'm just looking at the maximum to minimum ratio that we would observe in an average daily load shape. And I'm binning the treatment customers out into 4 quartiles. So the top left panel of this graph shows customers that have very flat load shapes. They have very low max to min daily load shape ratios. The customers in that bottom right quadrant of the plot are those that have the highest relative maximum to minimum load shape ratio. And you can see that, those customers have a much more peaking style of load shape, but that across the board, we're getting a very good match from the comparison group. This type of measurement gives us a lot of confidence that we're not just getting kind of an average match that worked out. We're getting a genuine match across the entire spectrum of customers that participated in the program. And that's a very important thing, because your comparison group is ultimately just as responsible for measuring savings in a program as your treatment customers are. So with all of that being said, now we have our comparison group, and we can go ahead and proceed with the next step of the FluxMeter approach. And this graph is showing results of making an event day measurement. And these are only the components of the calculation that feed into that treatment group part of it. So the first thing I want to draw people's attention to is this dashed line. The dashed line is the prediction that we would make of the usage in the absence of the program for customers that participated. The event period is shaded in gray. So we can clearly see that in that event period, these customers used a lot less than what we would have predicted. And so we're observing event period savings in the treatment group. We call this unadjusted savings of about 29%. So this particular event for this DRP on August 19th, it was a 2-hour event. And if this is all we knew, we would say this program saved 29% during the event period. But we make an analogous measurement for the comparison group. So these are all those customers that I showed back here. This is now we're measuring In this graph here, we're measuring the green curve here, whereas in this graph here, we're measuring the red curve here. So in this graph now, we make the same kind of prediction that we call it the counterfactual. That's the dotted red line. And now we see that these are non-participating customers. So we wouldn't necessarily expect to see a big event period savings. And indeed, we don't. We actually observed that the customers in the comparison group used a little bit more during the event period than we would have predicted. And that's again shown in that gray band of the plot in the solid red dots. So we see that we actually underpredicted consumption in the comparison group by about 5%. So we need to adjust the savings that we observed in the treatment group for these trends that we're observing in the comparison group. And that's what we do here. I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. That's what we do here. And so we say we saw about 29% savings in the treatment group, and we saw about 5% increase of consumption in the comparison group. So the savings that should be assigned to the program, these are the adjusted savings, is about 34%. And then finally, we scale that back to total consumption, and we find that the average customer saved about a kilowatt during the event, over the course of the event. Now, you can see there's a little bit different performance in the first hour of the event versus the second hour of the event, but the average across the event was about 1 kilowatt. Now we can bring all of this together and show, all of these components in a single plot. And this is just to kind of give a comprehensive overview of all of the components. Now, at the end of the day, it's mathematically equivalent to just adjust that treatment group counterfactual for the differences that we're observing between the observed and counterfactual usage in the comparison group. And that's what we do in this plot. So really, our best counterfactual for that is comparison group adjusted is shown in this red curve, the red curve with the square points. That's the comparison group adjusted counterfactual for the customers that participated in the program. And then the blue curve is the observed usage on this event day. And again, the event period is shaded in these in the gray band. And then finally, those black bars are the savings that are observed every hour of the event. And so this is really the best representation of how to think about what the flex meter methods produce: a comparison group adjusted prediction of event day usage, and then comparing that to the observed usage of the treatment group, which is in blue. And then you get the event period savings, and you actually get a measurement of savings every hour of the day, whether those are positive or negative savings. So I want to talk a little bit about differential privacy and just what it is and how we use it and how it protects non-participant data. So one of the things I have not mentioned is every single plot, every single number that I've shown that involves a comparison group or a comparison group adjustment has added noise. So we've added a little bit of noise to every single data point that the comparison group is associated with. So in this case, every single point on that counterfactual, every single observed meter reading, every single one of those X's that shows the percent difference between observed and counterfactual has a little bit of added noise to it. And that added noise serves to protect the underlying individual customer data. If a hypothetical attacker knew the exact averages or the exact statistics of an underlying data set, and then if you added or subtracted one single customer from that data set, you would be able to tell exactly what that customer's contributions to those statistics were. So for example, if I knew exactly the average load shape of a customer in a data set that consisted of 1,000 customers, and I added one more customer to that data set, I could look at how those averages changed, and I would be able to figure out the exact load shape of the customer that was added to that data set. That's a privacy risk. And a lot of modern hackers use those kinds of methods where they're able to differentiate the presence or the absence of one particular entry in a data set. So modern privacy methods need to protect against those kinds of attacks, and that's what differential privacy intends to do. So if I really ramp up the addition of noise on account of differential privacy, I can enhance the privacy of a data set, but I also decrease the utility of that data set. And this is sort of what that looks like. So in this bottom plot, I have exacerbated the amount of noise that we've added across the board on this comparison group measurement. And you can see right away that it's not as useful of a measurement. There's so much noise that we've added at this point that the measurement doesn't really allow us to make the kind of adjustment to savings that we could trust on account of a comparison group. There's just too much noise that we've added. So you get there are some studies that we've done recently, and I won't belabor them too much here, but we've found that you get a lot of privacy protection above and beyond traditional aggregation methods when you add a relatively small amount of noise, like what we've done in that upper plot, where you can still maintain the utility of a data set, but you can greatly enhance the protection of any individual customer present in a data set. So these modern types of differential privacy methods have been utilized by Google. They've been utilized by Facebook. They're utilized in the US Census. We're just taking them to the energy world, and we're finding out what works and how to apply them in the world of meter data. So this is really, like Jill mentioned in her introduction, this is a really key component of the FlexMeter methods, because it's what can enable and solve one of those main barriers to using comparison groups in the first place, which is the secure sharing of non-participant data. So I want to talk just a little bit more about some advantages of FlexMeter, and then we can stop and have some time for questions. But one of the things I want to point out is just that unlike some of the other baselining methodologies for demand response, the FlexMeter methods enable the measurement of savings across the course of the entire event day. So we are able to get an understanding of not only what the event period savings were, but of any take back effects. So if I'm participating in a demand response event and my thermostat is turned up a little bit during the event, I'm probably going to pre-cool my home, or maybe I'll run the dishwasher before or after those event hours. And so in so doing, some of these events certainly cause some load increases to happen in those hours that surround the event. And we see a variety of that kind of thing, and I'll show a few examples of that. But we also see some events and some customer bases actually achieve savings in those non-event hours on those event days. And this is really specific to the event. This type of take back can really be, it can be significant. And so, one of the things we need to be understanding and planning for and able to measure is, if we have a 2-hour event, that 2-hour event may be part of a 4-hour block that the CAISO needs load reduction. So we need to understand if we're actually causing an increase in consumption in these hours right before or right after an event. We need to have a way to quantify that and understand the impact on the grid. And so I just want to give a few examples of this kind of measurement across the course of an entire day, and make a few comments about the FlexMeter methods with respect to other types of methods that are commonly utilized. So this is just an example of an event where we clearly see quite a bit of take back that's occurring in the middle of the day, quite a bit of increased usage that's occurring before this event itself. Now, if I'm using a day matching baseline, then all of this take back is being built into the adjustment where I'm scaling up that baseline during the event period. And that's going to inflate the savings values during the event period artificially. So take back really has an impact, can have an impact, especially if it occurs like this throughout not just 1 or 2 hours right before or after an event, but it really occurs throughout the course of the midday hours. These are the very hours that would commonly be utilized in a same-day adjustment. But we're able to not only avoid that issue, we're able to actually make a measurement of the load impacts during these non-event hours on account of the event itself. Here's an example where there was actually load reduction that occurred across those similar set of midday hours. And these load reductions would actually cause a day matching baseline to underscale if you're using the same day adjustment. So it's just to say that sometimes take back occurs this kind of way where there's increased usage. Sometimes you actually have savings. It just depends on the nature of the program, the nature of the customers, and how they react to the event. So a couple summary results. One of the things that we wanted to show in this study was, or to test in this study, was whether or not these flex meter methods could be utilized across, not just 1 or 2 kinds of programs in 1 or 2 territories in California, but could they be utilized across many different kinds of programs, both res and non-res, and programs that had, very different types of interventions with customers. And I think we've been able to show that, yes, in fact, these methods work quite well across a spectrum of programs. So all of these programs, we're looking, the left-hand panels are just how savings occurred throughout the course of events, which went as long as 7 hours in some cases. The take back in those pre-event or post-event hours is shown in the red bars. And we're measuring residential programs on the left, 3 distinct residential programs, and a couple different non-residential programs on the right. And all of this is on an apples to apples basis. There are no methodological differences that would cause anybody to think, well, I can't compare one to the other. These are all measured with the same exact set of comparison group methodologies. And we're able to say then with confidence, here's one program versus another program versus another program. And not that these programs are competing with each other, but you do want to have that consistency of measurement. It's very important for demand response to be a scalable and credible resource, which has been a problem with some of the existing methodologies and some of the controversies that have occurred with the scaling factors that are being utilized. One of the things I want to point out is just there's, of course, a report that goes along with all of this. If folks are interested, I would encourage you to read the full report, and we'll provide a link to that report. But I wanted to point out that there is an appendix in this report that details a data specification so that measurements can be made consistently, accurately, transparently, quickly. And these data specifications exist for both demand response providers who would be providing participant data, as well as the load serving entities that would be providing non-participant data for the formulation of comparison groups. This was probably the least, the least sexy part of this study, but one of the most important parts of this study is to really specify how you can execute these methods consistently and at scale. And the data specification is an important piece of that. We did some work on error and uncertainty. I think I probably won't go into a lot of that right now, but there is a section that folks have questions. But I think I'll stop and just see if anybody has questions right now, and we can talk about anything related to the study or otherwise that folks would like to ask about.
Adam, I just point you to a question in the chat from Matt DeLuke.
Okay, so Matt says, can a comparison meter be matched to more than one participant, or do we need as many comparison meter? Okay, so this is a really good question. This is something we've gone back and forth on. So the question is, let's say that we've got one comparison meter that is the best match for, say, 5 or 10 different treatment meters. We make an attempt to not have any duplicity in the comparison group because we don't want any single or handful of comparison meters to have an outsized impact on the results of the measurement. Every single comparison meter that we're pulling in is going to influence the savings measurement, and it's going to influence that measurement based on based on, everything that comparison meter is experiencing. So, it could be that they're having a typical normal day. It could also be that, they have their family over for dinner and they're using a lot more, or whatever it is. So, we want to avoid overweighting the comparison group toward any individual meters, or having meters that, add like that create a risk that you will have statistical noise on account of a handful of meters that cause undue error in your savings calculation. So we make an attempt to not pull in any duplicate meters in the initial comparison group selection. If we cannot match enough meters, then we will relax that requirement. But for the most part, everything you're observing in this study is 1 meter matched, is comparison meters that have not been matched multiple times to different treatment meters, and therefore are weighted more heavily. Other questions? Did everybody understand everything I said? That would be great. Any questions for Jill or the CAISO?
Looks like we just got another question from Dan. What's the dotted black line that appears in some of the charts?
The dotted black lines here, like in this particular chart, are just meant to guide the eye. It's basically everything in blue is an event hour. And so if you look at the bars just to the right of the vertical dotted line, that's event hour 1 versus event hour 2, 3, 4, all the way up to event hour 7, because some of these demand response programs called events for up to 7 hours of duration. And you can see, for example, some of these events or some of these DRPs tended to produce savings that persisted over the course of many event hours, which is quite impressive. Other DRPs produced, much stronger savings, but those events lasted a shorter time frame, and they experienced greater degradation of savings from 1 hour to the next. Everything to the left, yeah.
Oh, sorry. He was actually looking at one of the other load profile
one of the other
load profile.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, let's take a look.
There's a lot of dotted black lines.
Oh,
so
yeah, there's a lot of dotted black. Let me just go through a few of them. Like this one, the dotted black, the horizontal dotted black line is just to signify where 0 is. So everything, below that is event period load reduction or load reduction. Everything above that is increased consumption. This other dotted black line is the temperature. So you can see, for instance, in this case that, the temperature peaked around 97, 98 degrees on this day. This was August 15th, and this was in a particular service territory. Temperature peaked around 98 degrees. And so, one of the things we wanted to do is provide that overlay of temperature, not because temperature informs the Caltrak model prediction. And that's one of the really important things about how the flux meter methods operate that contrasts with day matching baselines. With the day matching baseline, you're really not producing a baseline that is responsive in any way to temperature. It's just a average load shape of the previous event days. And in some cases, you can say, well, we want to take the days that have, that are most like the event day. Those are those weather matching baselines. But when you have a series of extreme heat wave days like we have here, the baseline days, the high temperatures might be 85 degrees. And then all of a sudden, you have a 105 degree day. And that temperature really drives a difference in how customers use energy that is not well captured by a day matching or weather matching baseline. So the fact that the Caltrak model is responsive to temperature on an hourly basis gives it a really important characteristic that can lend confidence in what we're doing, along with the fact that we're then also adjusting for any error or any issues that we're observing in a comparison group. So hopefully that answers that. There are a few other probably dashed lines. Let's see. Here again, it's just kind of separating zero or showing where zero is. This may be the one you're referring to. This dotted line is, so if we all go all the way back to the difference of differences calculation, like if I just take this, the way this calculation is conducted is, first, again, we look at the prediction of consumption. In this case, we're looking at the participating customers. And then we look at the observed consumption every hour. These X's represent the percentage difference between the observed consumption versus what we had predicted. So in this case, the percentage difference is maybe 35%. We then do that same exact thing with the comparison group. So in this case, in that particular hour 17, there really wasn't much of a difference, but in hour 18, we observed that there was, somewhat of a difference between the prediction and the observed. Now, the reason we're doing all of this first on a percentage basis, which is what's represented by these X's, is that it allows us to adjust the treatment group counterfactual for the trends that we're observing in the comparison group, which doesn't leave us exposed to any just error on account of a slight mismatch between the treatment group and the comparison group. If I'm a customer that participated in an event and I'm using 10 kilowatt hours, let's just say I'm using 10 kilowatt hours in hour 17, and the comparison group that gets selected to represent me is using maybe 20 kilowatt hours. That's just a hypothetical, it's just an illustrative example, but the comparison group is using 20 kilowatt hours, I'm using 10 kilowatt hours in the prediction. Then any difference, if I just take the absolute magnitude of that difference and adjust the treatment group counterfactual accordingly, then I'm building in error on account of mismatch between the comparison group and the treatment group that isn't necessary. If I do all of this first on a normalized percentage basis, then there's no direct error that gets introduced into the calculation, because the comparison group is tending to use a little more or tending to use a little less than the treatment group. And then at the end of it, because we're adjusting on a percentage basis for the trends that we're observing in the comparison group, we can always scale it back up using the treatment group counterfactual, which is what we've done in this case. So we go from a percentage back to the magnitude of consumption in this last step. So that's a good question. Thanks for asking that.
I think there were a few more questions that were popping up in the chat. We're trying to answer some of them with text, but it's also time to go. So I think the last question I was typing and trying to type an answer to was how much data is used to build a baseline prediction model, days, weeks, or months?
Yeah, that's another. Yeah, I can answer that very quickly. Yeah, that's another very good question. You don't want to use data across the whole year because winter isn't really representative of a hot summer day. So we use 45 days in the pre-event period in order to select a comparison group. That is actually stipulated by the CAISO tariff, that you can't use any post-event data to select a comparison group. But we then use a 45-day pre-period baseline and a 15-day post-period baseline. So it's 45 days pre, 15 days post of an event. And we black out all of the event days in the baseline period. So event days themselves are blacked out for both treatment customers and comparison customers. And in so doing, we make sure that we're not building a model that is predicting the kinds of load reductions that you would typically observe on an event. You obviously don't want to build that into your model. So 45 days pre, 15 days post, that allows us the best chance at capturing temperature data that is similar to event days on either side. That informs the time of week and temperature model. And then we black out event days in that time frame as well.
Right. And for when these methods are used for energy efficiency, we use the full year matching
That's right.
energy consumption data.
Yep.
Great. Well, I think that since we're at time, we need to say goodbye at this juncture. I did want to put in a plug for a webinar that we're going to be hosting next week, dedicated to differential privacy. Adam gave some of the details on how it's technically done. We're going to have more of a policy discussion about it next week and talk about how differential privacy could be more effectively incorporated into data access frameworks. So I'll be moderating a discussion with Michael Murray from Mission Data, David Littell, who will represent the Regulatory Assistance Project, and Chris Villarreal from Plugged In Strategies. So join us next week for that. And thank you to Adam and Jill for their insights today. Feel free to follow up with any questions you have or deeper dives, and we'll send out the recording and the updated report to all the registrants.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.